Today, 25th May, the crisis in Ukraine continues. In some respects, it's getting more dangerous with a continued pattern of Western escalation. And we also have further clarity from the Russians about their own intentions. And we also have further news from the battlefronts, which, to anticipate, suggests continued problems, in fact, escalating problems for Ukraine. Let's first of all begin with the pattern of Western escalation. Firstly, Secretary Blinken has just announced that there is going to be another $275 million package of aid for Ukraine. The aid package supposedly includes missiles for the HIMARS, multiple launch rocket system. I am confident that, in fact, the missiles that are going to be supplied are going to be more ATACMS missiles. Ukraine has got through what I suspect is the bulk of the ATACMS missiles that it was provided in March, and the United States, therefore, is obliged to replace those missiles with further missiles. I'm going to come back to the topic of the ATACMS later in this program, because I noticed that there's suddenly been a spike of what I think are largely alarmist comments from various people about, on the Russian side, I should say, about their effectiveness. But I'm going to return to that later in this program. Anyway, one way or another, that is clearly a further act of escalation. The United States, by the way, and for the record, is running through the $13.8 billion military package appropriation for military supplies for Ukraine extremely fast. I am not sure how much exactly out of that appropriation has been spent, but I'm guessing that it's several billion now, and I doubt that it's going to last at the rate the United States is going through with this appropriation. I doubt it's going to get to November, just saying. But anyway, we will come to that now, because, of course, the United States has another, or I should say correctly, the Biden administration appears to have another idea in mind about how the conflict in Ukraine can be kept going, even if the administration loses the election in November, how it can be kept going without further appropriations. Now, in previous programs, I have said that the idea that appeared to be circulating in the United States some months ago was to seize the entirety of the frozen Russian assets, something like $300 billion worth, and use those to keep up support for Ukraine, to all intents and purposes, indefinitely, or at least for a very long time. The funding would be provided to Ukraine. It would be administered, presumably, by a fund, and that funding would provide weapons for Ukraine. And that would be enough to keep the war going. Well, the United States, by some estimates, has spent $175 billion in aid for Ukraine. So $300 billion would presumably provide funding to keep the war going for roughly 2 years at the same rate of expense. So that, I think, was the original plan. It has been significantly scaled down because of strong opposition in Europe, from the legal community there, from the banking community there, from the central bankers there, and from Euroclear itself, where the bulk of the assets were held. Strong opposition to the confiscation of the Russian frozen assets for this purpose. I'm not going to rehearse the arguments again. I've discussed them many times. Suffice to say, such a plan would grossly violate the whole concept of sovereign immunity. Outside an actual war situation between Russia and the West, which Western leaders themselves go out of their way to deny exists, such an act would be manifestly illegal. And anyway, European governments receiving warnings about the implications of doing such a thing from countries like China and Saudi Arabia have backed off. Anyway, over the last couple of weeks, with the support of Euroclear, but apparently with deep misgivings from other sections of the European financial community, nonetheless, Western governments, the G7 governments, have gradually edged forward towards a plan to use the interest from the frozen Russian assets, supposedly between 3 and 5 billion euros a year, to seize that interest and to use that principally to continue funding the supply of weapons to Ukraine. Now, the latest plan, the plan that's been discussed or mentioned in various media outlets, and the plan that is coming from the United States, is for the G7 states to grant Ukraine a $50 billion loan secured against this interest. So the idea is the interest would continue to accrue. It would then be paid to the loan body that would manage this loan. And we're told that the World Bank, incredibly, appears to be willing to be that body, something which, to my mind, fundamentally contradicts the original purpose of the World Bank, and which I would have thought must be entirely contrary to its founding documents. I'm not entirely sure, by the way, that this is actually so, but that's what I've heard. Anyway, the World Bank would apparently play a role in administering this loan. The loan would provide $50 billion for Ukraine. That would be used to obtain weapons, to buy weapons, and the loan would be gradually paid off over a period of around 10 plus years through the interest that is being collected from the frozen assets. I maintain the view that this idea is every bit as illegal and every bit as subject to legal challenge as the idea of confiscating the assets as a whole. Anyway, we were getting reports a few days ago that the G7, which includes the major European states, it includes Germany, France, and Italy, had gradually come round and were prepared to accept this idea. However, yesterday, the German finance minister, Christian Lindner, appeared to cast doubt and said that the idea still needed to be worked out. There were still many legal issues and unresolved legal problems. And this morning, Reuters has published what it says is the draft statement that the G7 is going to issue to make on this specific point. And from what I can see, it appears to be backtracking. It is not mentioning a $50 billion loan facility. It's very vague about what exactly is going to happen. I assume what has actually happened is that the German government specifically, and perhaps the EU authorities in general, have received further advice, and the advice has been strongly negative against this proposal. Now, to be very clear, I don't think the G7 countries are especially worried about legal challenges against this decision, if it's ever made, in their own domestic courts. I say that because, though I'm quite clear in my mind that this is illegal, the events of the ICC, with its recent decision to issue arrest warrants against Western leaders, some Western leaders of a particular country. Anyway, we've seen how that has provoked an extremely strong reaction from the United States government, and how, in effect, pressure is being applied to that court. And I'm confident that domestic courts on this kind of issue in the G7 area would follow the lead of their governments. I say confident, not absolutely certain, given the legal doubts that there are about this issue. But I personally would be surprised if there is a successful challenge in the domestic courts within the G7 states. There is a further issue, by the way, which is that I'm not at all clear how the Russians would be able to bring such a challenge. I suspect that it would be very difficult indeed for the Russians to find law firms within the G7 territories that would be prepared to represent them in cases like this, risking the wrath of Western governments by doing so. Just saying. But the point is that this undoubtedly is an issue where there is a global jurisdiction, and it is entirely possible that the Russians could bring claims against this act in territories outside the G7 area, and that might be extremely difficult to contest by Western governments. I suspect that that, more than anything else, is the single factor that is causing restraints here. But anyway, that is the plan. Provide Ukraine with $50 billion loan, secure it against the interest from the Russian frozen assets. As I said, to say that it is legally dubious is an understatement. To my mind, it is an absurd idea. But that appears to be what Western governments are heading towards. It's perhaps difficult, given the doubts and given the legal objections, to press forward with this quickly. But of course, there's plenty of time between now and the November election to do so. And perhaps it's important to remember that the Biden administration, even if it loses the election in November, will remain in office until January of next year. And that gives plenty of time, I would have thought, for any objections to be overcome, and for this plan, this, I think, disastrous plan, by the way, to be agreed. By the way, I should say that, in my opinion, if the concern is not legal, but rather the credibility of the global credibility of the European financial system, I think that is as ruinous to its long-term credibility as a safe haven in which to place funds, as would be the outright seizure of the Russian assets themselves. I think that legally, this is dubious to say the least. In my opinion, it is no less dubious than the outright seizure of the assets. I think it would also be disastrous for the credibility of the safe haven status of the Eurozone. But anyway, that's my opinion. Western governments have decided, they're so fixated with this issue, they've decided to press forward and have moved forward urgently with this project. I suspect that sooner or later, at some point over the next few months, they will decide to do it. That, at least, is my own view. Anyway, that's one act that is going to be made. It is a serious escalation. It blurs, as a Financial Times article brilliantly put it some months ago, it blurs the difference, the distinction between states of war and peace, because seizing assets of sovereign governments is an act that normally, in fact, that historically, legally, could only be done in wartime. But the United States government, the Biden administration, is determined to do it, and do it sooner or later. I am sure it will be done. Anyway, that's one very serious escalation, something to follow. It looks as if a final decision has been put off for several weeks, perhaps months, but it will happen. Before I leave this topic, I am going to make one quick observation about it. We're being told, and I've seen articles appear in the media in the West about this, both in Britain and the United States, that part of the purpose of doing this is to make the whole question of funding for Ukraine Trump-proof. That seems to be an admission on the part of the Biden administration that it stands a real prospect of losing the November election. Just saying, if they were completely, serenely confident that they would win and that they would get a majority in Congress, presumably, they would not feel the need to take these dangerous risks. Anyway, let's move on. The other topic, which I've discussed yesterday at very great length, indeed not just yesterday, but over the course of several programs now, is this running campaign that is now underway to authorize Ukraine to launch strikes at Russian facilities deep inside Russia using Western weapons. Now, we're told that this idea crystallized after what we're told was a somber visit to Kiev by Secretary Blinken. This is, of course, the visit where Secretary Blinken played his guitar to the dismay, I suspect, of most Ukrainians. You may remember that yesterday I discussed an article by Timothy Garton Ash, fervid supporter of Ukraine, somebody who absolutely wants a Ukrainian victory, and as he says quite openly, a Russian defeat in the conflict. Anyway, Timothy Garton Ash, over the course of that article, says that medical opinion in Ukraine now is that half of the population is suffering from PTSD, which is astonishing, and that the army is becoming, the Ukrainian army is becoming increasingly demoralized, given the extent to which it feels that the Russians are overmatching it in every sector, in terms of manpower, training, and equipment. We'll come to that shortly. And lastly, we have, he also mentioned that there is growing bitterness in Ukraine against the West for the way in which they're supposed to have betrayed Ukraine over the course of this war. And, well, that's what Timothy Garton Ash said. It's not what I said. And I can't help but wonder how these angry, stressed, desperate people will have responded to Secretary Blinken playing a guitar in a cafe in Kiev. But anyway, put that aside. It was apparently a somber visit. Now, we weren't told that at the time. On the contrary, again, when Blinken left and when he was at the airport, we were given the impression that it was a successful and visit with complete mutual understanding reached. Now the reports admit that it was a somber visit. Clearly, the Ukrainians very unhappy with the entire military situation, and in fact becoming increasingly desperate about the entire military situation, and conveying that fact to Blinken himself. And incidentally, yesterday I read a report, admittedly, this is in the Russian media, it was in Redovka, which is a Russian newspaper. I've said many times, on the nationalist, patriotic spectrum of Russian opinion, but I've generally found it very accurate. And it said that there are reports in Kiev that Zelensky is deeply angry and feels very betrayed by the failure, the refusal of the Western powers to commit forces, their own forces, to the defense of Ukraine. He apparently understands that that is the only thing that can reverse the situation now. Anyway, let's move on. Blinken coming back supposedly with this very somber frame of mind, and he's suddenly become this advocate of giving permission to Ukraine to launch missile strikes anywhere they want against any target they wish in Russia using Western weapons. And others, of course, have weighed in to support this disastrous proposal. And one of those, inevitably, unsurprisingly, was Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, who has been a consistent voice ever since this crisis first began, basically in 2021, a consistent voice against any compromise with the Russians at all, and a consistent voice in favor of every conceivable escalation that is proposed by anyone. Something which I have to say, I think has been disastrous in its effect over the course of this entire crisis. Many suggest that Stoltenberg has some objective bureaucratic reasons to promote the position of the NATO bureaucracies. Perhaps he does. But I have to say, his tone has been so extreme at so many times and so aggressive at so many times that I can't help but think that he has some visceral issue with the Russians, which is playing itself out over the course of this conflict, something which appears to be true of all sorts of other Western leaders as well. Anyway, put all that aside, he, of course, has now come out and has publicly endorsed this idea. It is clear that it still has its opponents. Chancellor Scholz of Germany seems to be increasingly nervous about the direction events are taking. He has been speaking recently, once again, ruling out the deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine. In fairness, Stoltenberg has also done so, and Stoltenberg has also ruled out the idea of NATO air forces operating on Ukrainian territory and shooting down Russian missiles. Anyway, Scholz has rejected, Scholz appears to be rejecting that idea. He is standing firm against the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Taurus missiles having the longest range of any of the Western missiles that have been spoken about, the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows, the Scalps. The Taurus missiles have a range of around 500 kilometers, so they could certainly reach targets deep inside Russia. He again says that it would be impossible for the Ukrainians to operate these missiles themselves, and German law prohibits the Germans themselves from doing so. And in the past, he's rejected ideas about the British doing it in place of the Germans. So he seems to be taking a strong line against providing Ukraine with Taurus missiles. And for once, I have to say that I get the sense that this seems to be the solid position of the SPD, Scholz's parliamentary faction. And it seems to be a position that, for the moment at least, is holding across the German government, this very creaky German government. Though, of course, Scholz has taken what appear to have been strong positions in the past, but has ultimately backed away from them. The two countries that have been the most outspoken hardliners on the Western side, France and Britain. Macron talking about sending troops to Ukraine. That seems to be an idea that the Americans are, for the moment, ruling out. It's interesting that Blinken came up with this idea about providing Ukraine with long-range permission to use conduct attacks on Russian territory, and he doesn't seem to be talking about sending ground forces or anything like that to Ukraine. Anyway, the British and the French seem to be remaining silent in response to all of this. The British and the French, of course, were the recipients of strong warnings from the Russians about 3 weeks ago. For the moment, at least, they don't seem to be especially keen on jumping on this particular bandwagon. The British, of course, have the added complication that they're in the middle of a general election. And incidentally, it is interesting that for the moment, the Ukraine issue doesn't seem to be featuring very much in the various positions that the parties are taking in the general election in Britain. They seem to be avoiding, as far as they can, as much as they can, a general discussion of the topic, almost certainly because they sense that the British public is not keen on further escalation. So anyway, it does seem as if this idea is running into some resistance. But we've seen this happen before, and it is likely that sooner or later that resistance will be overcome. Now, to repeat again, the Russians have made it very clear that they will not simply sit back and allow their territory to be attacked by Western weapons in this way. A Russian military official, or I should say retired military official, has already spoken about the possibility, if something like this happens, of the Russians retaliating against depots in Poland, specifically in Poland, where these Western weapons are gathered before they are dispatched to Ukraine. That would be a colossal escalation. But to repeat again, the Russians might be prepared to attack targets in Europe. I don't believe they would attack targets in the United States. But what many people are overlooking is that the United States in particular has far-flung forces to a far greater extent than any other country does, including Russia, by the way. And the Russians could operate using plausible deniability, striking US assets, assisting other parties to strike US assets at any of the many parts of the world where the United States is located. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians, for their part, are trying to demonstrate their willingness to attack Russian strategic targets. Now, I think it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, they attacked a satellite facility, a radar satellite, space-based facility in Crimea. I've heard, and again, I have no confirmation of this one way or the other, that that particular radar station is out of operation. But yesterday, reports came through that they also attacked another radar station, this time deep inside Russia. This attack was not carried out using ATACMS missiles. It was carried out with drones, and it was a major radar base in a place called Armavir in Russia. That radar, again, it dates back to the Soviet era. I can remember it being discussed then. It is part of Russia's long-range air defense radar system tracking the potential launch of Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles. So it is a major, very important radar station, and it is clear that the drones got through and they have done damage. Now, these types of radars, the one in Armavir, as I understand it, are modular in their construction. It can probably be repaired quite quickly, contrary to what some people think. That's my understanding of the way it's built. It is admittedly an old radar, though it's still a very powerful one. And I would have thought nonetheless that the Russians have the component parts to repair it, and that they will repair it fast, probably within a space of a few weeks at most. Also, it's also important to say that this is not the first time that the Ukrainians have attacked strategic facilities deep inside Russia. Way back in 2022, they were sending jet-powered drones all the way to the Engels air base, where Russia's strategic bombers are based, trying to do damage to that air base and to target those strategic bombers. The attacks were unsuccessful. They didn't do any significant damage to Russia's strategic forces, strategic bomber forces, but that was an attack on an important component part of Russia's strategic triad. So it's not the first time that the Ukrainians have attacked strategic facilities in that kind, deep inside Russia, in that particular fashion. However, when the Ukrainians attacked Engels, they could validly say that Russian bombers, Tupolev 95 bombers based at Engels, were engaging in the long-range missile strikes that routinely happen against Ukraine. So Engels was playing a role in the war that is playing out at the moment in Ukraine. The attack on Armavir attacks a facility that has no connection at all to the special military operation. It is not involved in it. Now, it's been suggested that the United States and people in Washington were involved in this attack. If they were, and they might well have been, by the way, then all I would say is that they're taking colossal risks attacking facilities of this kind. By the way, just to say, the United States has all kinds of radar stations located all around the world. Again, it's not impossible to make attacks on radar stations, including radar stations involved in all kinds of strategic operations. In Turkey, for example, just say, without attacking radars located in the American mainland, in the continental United States. The Russians might also respond by interfering with American early warning satellites. They have that capability. Apparently, they're able to blind these satellites, or at least interfere with their operations without actually destroying them. This is an incredibly dangerous game that is being played. If people in the West, in Washington, are really participating in this kind of thing, then it demonstrates how desperate some people are becoming and how they're striking out in all kinds of directions. Now, just to say that just as the Russians ultimately proved successful in protecting Engels, there have not been any further Ukrainian attacks on Engels for, well, I think over a year now. I suspect that the Russians will fairly quickly be able to secure their protection of their other strategic assets that are potentially at risk from this kind of attack. The reason I suspect why the Ukrainian drones were able to do this damage to this particular radar station is because the Russians, knowing, of course, that it is not a participating in the work of the special military operation, probably took no particular precaution to protect it from drones. But now they will, and I suspect that before long, most of these facilities will be hardened, and of course the mechanisms to do that exist, and nobody should be in any doubt about that. And that now brings me to some of the other major developments that are happening on the battlefields. Firstly, we're hearing that the Russians are now successfully jamming the Starlink system. This is the system that the Ukrainians use for communications. It's based upon Elon Musk's Starlink satellite array. Elon Musk has been at various times very unhappy about the fact that the Ukrainians have been using Starlink in this fashion. He's spoken out and criticized the use of it, but nonetheless, and notwithstanding, Starlink continues to be used in exactly this way by the Ukrainians, and Musk himself has gone along with this, despite making repeated, in my opinion, entirely valid protests that the war itself, the way it is being conducted in Ukraine, is misconceived. This is something that people pay no attention to. Well, it seems that the Russians are now starting to jam the Starlink system, and that they're increasingly doing it in a more and more sophisticated way. They have made, I think, various attempts to jam Starlink before. I suspect that they've been testing out their equipment, which they've probably been developing over the last 2+ years. Apparently, when the Russian forces crossed into Kharkiv region from Russia, was it 2 weeks ago? It seems so much longer now. Apparently, the Starlink system in the area was jammed to the point of being completely out of action. And it seems that the Russians, having now established that they are able to jam Starlink, are now expanding gradually the field of their jamming of Starlink, interfering with Ukrainian communications in more and more places. Now, of course, the United States, Starlink itself, will try to find ways around the jamming. But assuming that the Russians stay ahead, which they might do, they are the acknowledged masters at this kind of thing, well, then that is a catastrophe for Ukraine. Its communications, its military communications, depend very heavily on the Starlink system. And one does wonder how exactly this could be countered. if Starlink is no longer functioning. Just saying. Now, the other thing that the Russians have been doing, apparently, and there's been a further article about this in the Washington Post, is that they've been able to jam successfully the GPS guided systems that the United States has been supplying to Ukraine. We've had reports about this at various points over the course of the conflict, starting all the way back in May 2023. There were reports that the Russians were successfully jamming HIMARS missiles. And then a short time ago, we got a further report that the Excalibur artillery shell is being successfully jammed. The Washington Post now tells us that the Excalibur has proved so ineffective that the Ukrainians finally stopped using it completely last year. And the Washington Post tells us that the HIMARS system has been ineffective as well. Now, this brings me to the topic of the ATACMS missiles. Now, the ATACMS missiles were supplied to Ukraine in quantity in February. They've been used by the Ukrainians in various attacks in Crimea and, almost exclusively, as far as I can tell, in Crimea, though some missile strikes have also been launched in other places on the line of contact. If the normal HIMARS systems are no longer working, then that all but confirms, as far as I'm concerned, that when an aid package, like the one that Secretary Blinken has just announced, says that the United States is providing more ammunition from the HIMARS system, what they're really supplying is more ATACMS missiles, because these are, of course, the missiles that get launched from the HIMARS system. Now, there has been a number of rather panicky pieces on the military summary channel by Simplicius the Thinker, saying that despite the fact that we've seen scores of ATACMS missiles shot down by the Russians, expensive HIMARS systems shot down by the Russians, the fact that the ATACMS have apparently been successful in penetrating in a number of places, which is inevitable, by the way, and have successfully destroyed 1, 2, or perhaps 3 S-400 or S-300 batteries. Again, there's some uncertainty as to what sort of batteries they are, that the ATACMS nonetheless is proving effective and successful. Now, I beg to disagree. Again, it comes back to the question of what you expect from the ATACMS. The United States is, or rather the Ukrainians, are launching huge volleys of ATACMS missiles, of which there is not an infinite supply. I understand that, contrary to claims, they are not actually in production. The missiles that we hear about are refurbished missiles, so they're not in serial production. And especially in the early stages, whenever weapon systems are supplied by the United States or the Western powers, it takes a short time, sometimes as short as 6 weeks, sometimes a bit longer, a couple of months, before the Russians work out how they work and adjust to them and are able to counter them. Now, the fact that the Russians are succeeding in shooting down so many ATACMS missiles when they have been first deployed suggests to me that as the Russian air defense system gets to understand the ATACMS system better, works out its vulnerabilities, from this point onwards, following that pattern, its effectiveness will decline. The fact that the ATACMS has not managed to achieve any dramatic results over the first 6 weeks or so, 2 months or so of its operation actually suggests that it will not be, over time, a particularly effective system. I say that because this has been the pattern with the HIMARS, which for a time did seem to be doing a certain amount of damage to the Russians. It was true initially, though, in a similar way, with the Storm Shadows and the Scalps. The Russians were quite successful right from the beginning in shooting down Storm Shadows and Scalps. Though always some got through, but gradually the number that got through diminished, and there's little sign now that these do a decisive amount of damage. And the same, I'm confident, will be the case with the ATACMS as well. Over time, probably it will take a couple of weeks or a couple of months at the most. We will see the Russian air defense system adjust. New methods of observation and of tracking will be developed. There will be better understanding of where the launchers that are launching these missiles are located. Drone surveillance will be improved. Satellite surveillance on the Russian side is of an entirely different level than it was back in 2022. It's only a question of time before the Russians, as I said, get on top of the problem. This has been the consistent pattern up to this time. So this is my own view about the ATACMS. Others, you can go with what Simplicus the Thinker or the Military Summary Channel is saying. But I think that what I am suggesting here is consistent with the history of this conflict up to this time. The point is that I suspect that it is the ATACMS and ultimately the Taurus missiles that are the systems that the West, or rather the Western advocates of deep strikes into Russia, are relying upon in order to inflict the damage on Russia that they wish. We saw that the attacks on the refineries, the oil refineries, failed to achieve as much as some people assumed. A certain amount of damage was done. There were no shortages of refined fuels in Russia at any point. The damage to the refineries was repaired very quickly, and now the Russians are faced with a glut of refined fuel on their domestic market. But of course, attacks on refineries by small drones, attacks on radar stations like Armavir with small drones, can only do a limited amount of damage. Attacks by missiles like the ATACMS, is a different matter altogether. Those could do a very substantial amount of damage indeed. And I think that is what the West is relying upon. So, and the Ukrainians are relying upon. Those are the weapons that they really seek to use. Now, to reiterate again, I think the Russians will get on top of such problem as the ATACMS missiles are currently presenting. So it is likely that these attacks are only going to have a limited amount of effectiveness, but they will be extremely provocative. off-the-scale provocative. To repeat a point I made before, it would be the first time in a proxy war that the red line has been crossed, the red line which has previously precluded superpowers involved in a proxy struggle from assisting their proxies to carry out attacks on the national territory of the adversary superpower. That has never happened at any time since the 1940s, and that is what we are now facing. How the Russians will react is difficult to say. Seymour Hersh, in his latest article, in which he's obviously been briefed by members of the US intelligence community, made the rather alarming point that apparently everybody in the United States understands that there is Russian red lines, but no one knows apparently where they are. Well, I would suggest that this is a red line. And I think that the Russians will react. They will react strongly. They will probably react in a time and a place of their own choosing. But it is difficult to see how this can prevent a further cycle of escalation, with that cycle of escalation possibly spreading to many points around the world. As the situation in Ukraine deteriorates, as the West faces strategic defeat in Ukraine, a strategic defeat it invited upon itself, we see all sorts of desperate and reckless plans being floated. Plans like sending ground troops to Ukraine, that seems to have been ruled out, at least for the moment. But that was what Macron was talking about a few weeks ago. He seems to have been shut up, at least for the moment, but we shall see. Attempts to try and send trainers, in other words, actually ground troops to Ukraine. Special forces, of course, have always been operating in Ukraine and have undoubtedly been engaged in actual combat roles. And this, I am sure, has been true ever since the start of the special military operation back in 2022. But to repeat again, the deployment, the open, public, official deployment of troops to Ukraine would be an incredible escalation. And now we're seeing the further escalation in which, despite repeated Russian warnings, this disastrous project of authorizing strikes on targets, including potentially strategic targets, deep inside Russian territory with Western weapons, is now being advocated by those who, as I have repeatedly said, have no reverse gear. Now, there is, of course, a disastrous lack of public discussion about this issue. I've not seen any real commentaries or debate in the West or in the Western media about the risks that all this involves. Once more, reckless decisions are being made by a small group of people who have been gambling consistently over Ukraine for years, arguably going all the way back to the 2004 Orange Revolution crisis. Gambling and, by the way, losing. And they are gambling again with hardly any public debate or public criticism of what it is that they're proposing to do. Anyway, there we are. That's what I wanted to say about all of this. Now, as I said yesterday in my program, there is, of course, the contrary view, which has been expressed strongly within Western governments. I've spoken in this program about Olaf Scholz. I've spoken about the group within the US government who increasingly think that the conflict in Ukraine is a massive diversion of American resources from the conflict they really care about, which is the one with China. And of course, there are a few voices now, but they're becoming more visible and more prominent in the United States, who are doubtful about the wisdom of the entire enterprise and of the whole direction of US foreign policy. These people are starting to appear and gain traction, especially in Congress, and to gain numbers, but they are still far from being a major influence on the course of debate. But anyway, yesterday I discussed how these people seemed once again to be refloating the freeze idea. This was discussed at length in an article in Reuters based on all sorts of sources supposedly close to President Putin. And I said in my program yesterday that it seemed to me that if you read the article carefully, it became fairly obvious that the sources in question are not people within the Russian government, and I very much doubted that they were especially close to President Putin or really familiar with the inner councils of the Kremlin. And a lot of the points they were making about Putin's anger, for example, over the failure of the Istanbul Agreement, well, all of that has been set out by the Russians extensively in open sources. Now, over the course of yesterday, I received a further email from someone, again, I'm not going to say who, but from someone who has explained, provided me with further reasons to doubt these sources that Reuters relied upon. This person has made the point that the way in which discussions in the Kremlin are described in the Reuters article is simply not consistent with the way actual discussions in the Kremlin involving Putin himself actually take place. And that Putin himself, far from being the somewhat emotional person described in the early part of that article, expressing frustration and all of that sort of thing, is somebody who, even when meeting his officials, is extremely disciplined in what he says and tends to keep his counsel, his private counsel, very much to himself. But anyway, suffice to say that Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has been busy over the last couple of hours refuting various stories that have been circulating both in the Financial Times and in Reuters. There was, by the way, a parallel article in the Financial Times, which I missed. Peskov has basically been saying that there is no thought in Russia of ceding any part of the four territories to Ukraine, which would, of course, be the case if a freeze of the conflict were to take place now. Kherson region, west of the Dnieper, is still outside Russian control. Much of the Donbass still is. Zaporozhye, of course, also is. Zaporozhye city is still under Ukrainian control. So Peskov has been denying this. But more importantly, we have now had a long set statement from President Putin, who is currently in Minsk, meeting with President Lukashenko of Ukraine. Now, Putin came to Minsk again with an immensely strong delegation. I don't know the full identities of all of the persons who attended, but certainly Lavrov was there, Belousov the new defense minister was also there. And I understand that Shoigu was there too, and all sorts of people from the economic side of the Russian government were there as well. By the way, on the relationship between Shoigu and Belousov, it's been made clear to me by the same source that I mentioned before that in terms of the political supervision of the conflict in Ukraine, that remains firmly within Shoigu's responsibility as Secretary of the Security Council and Putin's national security advisor. And Belousov's areas of responsibility are basically with tightening up control of the defense ministry and integrating the military industrial complex in terms of the civilian economy in the way that I'd previously discussed. So it will be Shoigu who will continue to remain the person to whom Gerasimov and the other military leaders report in connection with the progress of the special military operation. And it will be Shoigu who will pass on these reports to Putin. I believe that is correct, by the way. But anyway, let's move on and discuss what Putin said in Minsk, because he talked at length again about the Istanbul Agreement. His anger and bitterness at the way in which the Istanbul Agreement was wrecked is again there for all to see. You don't need secret sources to find that out. But he also, over the course of a press conference which he attended with Lukashenko, he also said that he now has doubts about Zelensky's ability to conduct further negotiations, because as of this point in time, there is a question mark over whether or not Zelensky remains the legitimate president of Ukraine. Who to negotiate with? I'm now reading from the Kremlin website. This is certainly not an idle question, I agree. Of course, we realize that the current head of state is no longer legitimate. As far as I know, we must look at what is written in the Constitution of Ukraine, which government bodies have the right to be extended under the Constitution of Ukraine without elections and election procedures, and which cannot count on these rights. This must be done through a judicial analysis. These are questions for the Ukrainian political and legal systems. And Lukashenko then chipped in and said, I absolutely agree with what Mr. Putin has just said. As for the expiration of Vladimir Zelensky's powers, there is no legal clarity on this issue, nor can there be any, because as you understand, they have deep democracy and everything has been stifled. I and we are often reproached for being dictators. Some others are also accused of this. Here is democracy in action. Neither the Constitutional Court of Ukraine nor other courts there say anything. Therefore, the legal clarity that the President of Russia was talking about is ruled out on this question. Now, what Lukashenko and Putin are talking about, and by the way, I should stress here that I make no claim to be any authority on Ukraine's constitution. I am totally agnostic on this point. But what Putin and Lukashenko are talking about is that the Ukrainian constitution apparently says that in the event of martial law, parliamentary elections cannot take place, but that it is silent on the question of presidential elections. Now, if that is so, and let me repeat again, I am not an authority on the Ukrainian constitution, and I'm not going to waste time trying to second guess what it means. As Putin and Lukashenko correctly say, that ought to be a matter for the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, which is taking no step in this matter at all. But anyway, if what Putin and Lukashenko say is correct, then on traditional legal construction, interpretation, that is to say, of documents, if there is silence on a point in a particular document, one should not construe a positive effect from that silence, by which I mean that if the Constitution precludes the holding of parliamentary elections during a period of martial law, but is silent on the question of presidential elections, then that ought to mean, applying, as I said, traditional principles of legal construction, as I have understood them, that this means that a declaration of martial law in Ukraine does not prevent presidential elections, which ought to happen when the term of the president, the constitutional term of the president, ends. In which case, of course, President Zelensky's decision to remain president without elections is unconstitutional and illegal. Let me repeat again, I am not saying that this is my view. I'm not going to try and second guess what the legal position in Ukraine is. That ought to be a matter for the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. It's a little concerning that nobody in Ukraine appears to be asking those questions of the Constitutional Court. I'm not even sure, by the way, whether the Constitutional Court of Ukraine at the moment even functions. But anyway, there we are. The point, anyway, put all that aside, is that Putin and Lukashenko are basically saying that since there's no clarity at all about Zelensky's legal status, they cannot anyway accept him as a party in negotiations. It is very straightforward. And nowhere in any comment that Putin has made over the course of this press conference is there the slightest hint that he's prepared to even consider the kind of negotiations that were being talked about in that article in Reuters yesterday, the one about a freezing of the conflict. Far from seeing these words of Putin, as I think some people do, as an invitation on the Ukrainians to change their government and change their leader so that negotiations can begin. Far from seeing it in that way, I would regard these words of Putin's, and indeed of Lukashenko's as well, as pointing to Russian doubts about negotiations being worthwhile. They question whether, if negotiations can take place in conditions of apparent illegality in Ukraine, that any document that might be agreed with the Ukrainians, or indeed with the Western powers, on Ukraine's behalf, would not have any legal force and could be repudiated by the other side at any time. So just saying, to me, these words look like they cast doubt on negotiations. I do not see on what basis people see them as pointing to negotiations taking place soon or the Russians seeking negotiations. As a matter of fact, there's something else that Lukashenko specifically says, in which he basically talks about the overall situation in Ukraine. And I think these words have been overlooked, though they are very interesting. The situation evolves as it evolves. These are Lukashenko's words. I think this year will determine much. We will wait and see. We are not in any rush, and less so is Russia. So the Russians, the Belarusians, they've worked out a common position, as Lukashenko himself is saying, and the Russians are not going to rush. It's going to be the policy that they have always followed, festina lente, make haste slowly, take it one step, one move at a time. The strategy is working. There is no point in moving forward faster. Doing so might in fact provoke an even more reckless and dangerous reaction from the West. Russia conserving its forces, keeping the numbers of its forces as low as possible, advancing along the front line, applying more and more pressure on Ukraine, waiting until the point comes, which we're not that far from now. Lukashenko says that this year will determine much. That point where the Ukrainian defense system, under the weight of its losses, finally collapses. And on that point, I'm going to say that we have now had some absolutely grim figures from the Russian Defense Ministry about what they say Ukrainian losses are. They claim, for example, that over the last week, Ukraine has lost 11,000 men killed and wounded. I believe that is a record over the entire period of the special military operation, and it is roughly double what the already very high levels of losses that Ukraine was absorbing just a few weeks ago. It seems that regularly now, every day now, Ukrainian losses are tracking figures of around 1,500 every day, dead and wounded. And just to make the further point here, if we accept that this is the number, 11,000 is maintained every week from this point onwards, which perhaps it won't be, but then again it might be, or perhaps at some point it might even start to go higher. Well, if that continues at this continuing pace, then Ukraine would be losing around 40,000 men, dead and wounded, every month. And let's say that Ukraine really did call up 500,000 men, according to its new mobilization law, which no one any longer believes. Then General Syrski has said that it can't and won't. But anyway, let's assume that it did. Well, then Ukraine would have lost all of those men, 500,000 men. They'd be dead or wounded over the course of a year's fighting if casualties were maintained at this level. In practice, Ukraine is likely to call up far fewer. The number being talked about is around 150,000. It appears that the mobilization is not going well, despite the drastic laws that Ukraine has passed. 150,000 is the number that some people are saying, well, that's about 4 months of losses. If this figure is sustained, it would take us to the autumn, and then, of course, Ukraine would be back where it started in terms of numbers of men on the battlefronts, only actually it would be far worse than that, because with every new recruitment drive, the quality, the training level, and the motivation of the men on the battlefronts continues to fall. Well, let us now talk about what is actually happening on the battlefronts. And briefly, President Zelensky and General Syrskyi have now have told us that they've managed to contain or control the situation in Kharkiv region, that the Russians are no longer advancing as fast as they originally were, and that the situation there is under control. Though General Syrskyi does go on to say that everywhere else the situation continues to go from bad to worse. Of course, part of the reason for the incursion in Kharkiv on the part of the Russians was precisely to weaken the other front lines by forcing the Ukrainians to redeploy troops to Kharkiv. So, in a sense, the Russians have already achieved what appears to have been that one major object. But have the Ukrainians really brought the situation in Kharkiv under control? The first thing to say is that apparently Zelensky toured the area and he saw for himself the fact that there are, to all intents and purposes, no fortified lines in the region. That all the stories about the elaborate fortifications Ukraine was building in Kharkiv region, that they've turned out to be a myth. So what Ukraine is trying to do, and it is clear that Zelensky has given orders to Syrskyi and to the Ukrainian military that Lipsy and Volchansk must be held at all costs, probably because he cannot risk politically the fall of Kharkiv, which I think he still believes, despite Putin's denials, is the ultimate Russian objective. Anyway, given the absence of fortified lines, what the Ukrainians are trying to do is try to hold positions by massing as many troops to the Kharkiv region as they can spare. And it's difficult to keep count of the numbers of units that have been deployed by Ukraine to this area. Apparently, as I said, these are principally battalions drawn from various units on the front line, but there's no doubt now that there are many thousands of Ukrainian troops in this area, and they are being concentrated in trying to defend Lipsy and Volchansk. And that has indeed slowed the Russians. In Lipsy, it's probably true to say that the Russians are at a standstill. In Volchansk, if you believe what the Russians say, which I on balance do, they are still advancing. They are still gaining ground, in some places several hundred meters a day, if you believe the reports of their Telegram channels, which are of course unofficial and are not provided by the Russian Defense Ministry. But what is also happening is that, of course, all of these large concentrations of Ukrainian troops close to the Russian border have put the Russians in a position where they can bomb and shell and launch missile attacks against Ukrainian troops in this area in large numbers and devastate their artillery forces that the Ukrainians have also tried hurriedly to deploy to this area too. And of course, all of this is going on even as Ukraine also loses armored vehicles. And then now there is, in effect, an admission from Forbes that Ukraine's armored vehicle park is now extremely severely depleted, so that units that had been mechanized units using infantry fighting vehicles and tanks have now had to redeploy to wheeled vehicles. in some places soft-skinned wheeled vehicles, trucks in other words, and that they are therefore in effect being converted into light infantry. So if you return back to that thing which I was discussing some months ago about the Russian policy of aggressive attrition, well, you can see how it is playing out in practice now again on the Kharkiv front. Ukrainian losses have spiked ever since the Russians began their Kharkiv offensive, and the effect on the Ukrainians has been devastating. Now, there are continued reports that the Russians are planning some major strike into Ukrainian territory in the Sumy Chernigov area. Whether they will or whether they won't, that all remains to be seen. Everywhere else on the front lines, the situation for Ukraine deteriorates, and it is deteriorating at a faster speed. I'm going to do today a relatively brief summary, but briefly, in Kupiansk area, reports are now circulating that the Russians are on the brink of capturing 2 more strategic villages on their way to the Oskol and Zherebets river lines. In the Chasov Yar area, there are multiple reports that the Russians have now enlarged their bridgehead west of what I used to refer to as the canal, and what many people refer to as the canal. A commentator who is also familiar with this structure has confirmed what was said to me some days ago by that other person who pointed out that it's not really a canal at all, it's really a pipe system. Anyway, this latest person, has suggested that rather than refer to it as a canal, it is better called an aqueduct. And this person has also said that it is almost certain that the pumping system that keeps this aqueduct operating has been taken out of action. So it is likely that the pipes have no water in them, which of course would make it easier for the Russians to dismantle part of the aqueduct system and to cross over to the other side. And for all I know, that is exactly what in some places has happened. The battle, by the way, in the eastern micro-district, the micro-district to the east of the aqueduct. I'm going to call it the aqueduct from now on. East of the aqueduct, we've got lots of films of it. It is like pictures out of Dante's hell. It is absolutely shocking to see the bombing and the shelling that is taking place of Ukrainian positions there is horrendous. There seem to be Russian tanks operating well inside the micro-district as well. The Ukrainians still have some tanks there too, though I suspect that their survival time is going to be very short. Presumably the Ukrainians on the western part of the aqueduct are trying to help their troops in the micro-district by shelling Russian positions and by sending drones, but it must be the case that before long this area will collapse. Anyway, this is a horrific battle, and one has to mourn the fate of the people who are caught up in it, Ukrainian and Russian, though I suspect again, given that they're largely cut off, it is the Ukrainians, as I said, who seem to me to be bearing the heaviest price. Further south, still, in the Ocheretino, Avdiivka area, we now have substantial information that the Russians are indeed storming the village of Novo-Alexandrovka to the northwest of Ocheretino. They appear to be working to enlarge this gap that they've punched in the Ukrainian front lines. And I understand that the Russians are now working to basically end the battle for Krasnogorovka. This film, which has appeared, of the Russians raising their flag on a building in the central part of Krasnogorovka, and it looks as if the battle for Krasnogorovka now is definitely coming to an end. There are still Ukrainian troops there. The Russians seem to be working to surround them, but I would guess that the Battle of Krasnogorovka is coming to an end now fairly soon. Bear in mind that Krasnogorovka is a town of about, I believe, 14,000 people. The Russians really began their operation in Krasnogorovka in March. It may seem like a long time if you watch these programs every day, but given that this is a fortified town close to Donetsk city, it looks as if the Russians are in the process of capturing it actually quite fast. Further south, the 79th Brigade of the Ukrainian army seems to be about to accept that this village of Paraskovievka in the Marinka, Kurakovo, Vugleda area is also about to fall to the Russians, and they appear to be accepting that the Russians are in a strong position to begin an operation to capture Konstantinovka, another somewhat bigger village as well. So the Russian offensive continues on every part of the front line. Every day, the Russians continue the advance, and the Ukrainian losses are horrific. I'm going to finish this program by once again returning to the topic of Volchansk. I mentioned in, I think it was yesterday's video, that in my opinion, the Ukrainian troops whose presence in the northern part of Volchansk, the part of Volchansk which accounts for the greater part of the city, in fact, or rather town, in my opinion, that those troops have been cut off. And I said that it looked as if the Ukrainians have been trying to assemble a force to relieve those troops in northern Volchansk, who are in effect surrounded or cut off from resupply, and whose position must be becoming increasingly difficult and perhaps even desperate. Well, there's been a lot of discussion. The Military Summary channel has been talking about this at length, about various operations by each side to destroy various bridges along the Volcha River and in the other rivers in this area. I think there's been some puzzlement as to what is going on. I think if one understands that these Ukrainian troops north of the Volcha River are in effect cut off and under siege, that it actually becomes relatively easy to understand this battle. The Ukrainians are trying to find a means to advance and to relieve these troops. The Russians, for their part, are making it more difficult by destroying the bridges along the water systems that would lie in the route on the way to them doing that. The Russians probably are building fortified positions to counter any attempt to try to, in effect, break this siege. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are obviously also worried about Russian counterattacks or Russian attacks, and that's why they're destroying some of their bridges as well. This pattern of destroying bridges makes sense if there is an operational crisis, involving the Ukrainian troops in northern Volchansk. And I don't think actually that this is so difficult to understand as it is or appears to be for some people. Well, this is where I'm going to end my program today. Tomorrow I'm going to start discussing this conference in Switzerland that the Western powers are convening, the rival meeting of the BRICS foreign ministers, which is taking place on the same day, the anger and petulant reaction this has provoked from the United States, and indeed the whole diplomacy relating to that conference, which dovetails with all of the other issues of escalation and attempts to try to get negotiations on a freeze of the conflict that I've been discussing both in this video and in the ones which have immediately preceded it. But this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't also forget that you can check out our shop. You can find again links for that and all kinds of amazing things there: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. At last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.